Can I say things?
You can. Hello. We are so glad everybody's here. My name's Diane Buis. We're giving people a chance to tune in. I see people coming in and I'm excited about that. With that, I'll get started in about 2 seconds or so. All right. We are live and I'm happy to be with you today. My name's Diane Buis here at MedTech Innovator, where I'm director of the US program. Welcome to MedTech Innovator Live number 9 in our series of weekly webinars that we do as part of the Accelerator program that runs for 4 months as an opportunity for our cohort companies across the 3 cohorts to learn from experts all across the ecosystem. For those of you joining us on the live stream, welcome. MedTech Innovator is the largest accelerator of medical devices in the world, and it's a downstream accelerator, which means that we're not looking for people with ideas, but people with companies that are up and running, have teams and prototypes and early evidence that the technology works, and then partner them with experts in the industry, strategics and others to help them bring their product to market as quickly and efficiently and with as much value as possible. The current US cohort has 61 companies in them. Welcome. They'll be able to stay on for Q&A after we bid the live stream goodbye. Our BioTools cohort has 19 companies and our Asia Pacific cohort has 24 companies. For those 104 companies in the 2023 cohort, we're so excited you're there. For our broader ecosystem, we're excited you're here. So if you're on the live stream, feel free to put your questions in the chat. And for our cohort companies, you can make use of the Q&A function. I'll call you up in the order that, that you ask questions at the end of the first hour when we go into private Q&A. And with that, it's my real privilege to introduce today's topic to you and to give our speakers an opportunity to introduce themselves. Today, we're talking about data and data security. And heck, when we're talking about the biomedical industry at large, but very specifically medtech, there could not be a more important topic. So it's my privilege to have with me Hassan Shanawani and Joe Saul. And I'll give both of them an opportunity to introduce themselves to you. I will start with Joe Saul and then pass the microphone on to Hassan.
Okay, thank you, Diane. Hi, I'm Joe Saul. I am currently serving as the Privacy and Security Officer for ICPSR, the Inter-University Consortium for Political and Social Science Research at the University of Michigan. That's a departure from my overall career. It's a deliberate shift to do something differently. I'm building a privacy and security program there. But prior to that, for give or take 13 years, depending on how you count the part after IBM bought us, I was the CSO. I had both the security and privacy hats for Truven Health Analytics, previously the healthcare business of Thomson Reuters, where we did healthcare data analytics and ultimately had care of 250 million patient lives worth of records, both in identifiable and de-identified form, that were used for data analytics, benchmarking, research, and so forth. Prior to that, I was part of the HIPAA implementation team at the University of Michigan Health System, and then served in the compliance office there until I got recruited out to private sector in 2008. So in a way, I've returned to the university, but while I'm not in healthcare in my daily job, one of the things my day job allows me to do is maintain a consulting practice where I largely consult on privacy issues to health tech startups. So I have that line as well. University is wonderful. I have to declare all conflicts very carefully, but I'm allowed to do it. So hi, that's why I'm here today, and I'm delighted to talk to you about this stuff. Hassan?
Thanks for that. I will hand it over to Dr. Hassan Shanawani. Would you tell us a little bit more about yourself and your work?
Sure. Good afternoon. I'm Hassan Shanawani. I am the Chief Medical Information Officer for what is known as the Veterans Integrated Service Network Part Region 10, which is Michigan, Ohio, and Indiana. I've been a practicing physician in the VA for about 20 years, including my medical training. And prior to this role, I was the Chief Quality Officer for Medicare Advantage for Blue Cross Blue Shield of Michigan, where I managed a number of our data elements, as well as the medical director for the UAW retiree account, which is one of the largest private retiree insurance agencies, insurance accounts in the country. Actually, it is the largest. And prior to that, I was the head of the VA's effort to move from an in-house grown EHR, the VA produced the first medical record in the world, to an off-the-shelf product in with a vendor, previously Cerner, now Cerner Oracle. And I was the lead for data migration and syndication, which is the management of the data, as well as one of the leads, the functional leads for data security in the new, what is known as the federal enclave, where our data is shared with the Department of Defense, which has a whole new tier of security. Before all of that, I was actually a systems engineer and physician for the VA's National Center for Patient Safety, where we would work with industry partners to develop minimum technical requirements for VA contracts. So if the VA wanted to purchase a piece of hardware or software, there is a whole vetting process. The government, as you know, needs to be agnostic as to all of that purchasing, and I would provide consultative services specifically within quality and safety and meeting veteran-facing value. As an aside, like Joe, I'm here on my own personal account. Anything I say does not represent the views of VISN10, the VA, or the federal government. And I also maintain a small consultative service on the side where I advise companies mostly in the healthcare data space and interoperability in healthcare exchanges, health information exchange. A lot for us to talk about. Looking forward to your questions and the discussion today.
Fantastic. I'm so glad both of you are here. And thanks for that. I feel doing people justice and their backgrounds does not work, reading something off a bio. So I appreciate both of you going into the background. You've definitely teed it up for us. The discussion is around data. And so let's perhaps just level set on what are we talking about, right? What are the different types of data, the different sources of healthcare data, their applications, transmission. Joe, you've worked in the public and private sector. Both of you actually have, with data sets large and small. And so, perhaps, what are the potential sources of healthcare data you look at and used to look at? And what does that look like from your vantage point? So I'll start with Joe and then hand it over to you, Hassan, just to level set. What are we even talking about?
Sure. I mean, I think I'll taxonomize this, and Hassan may well recognize why I'm doing this. He and I have been involved with some of the same organizations at different times during our career, including Hassan, the VIBA. The UAW trust that you're talking about. That's all I'm going to say on that, but I think you can put the pieces together. I like to think of some sources are provider organizations. That's everybody from a large healthcare system, like say Michigan Medicine or Sparrow Health or, Beaumont, that kind of thing, to a physician group practice like Integrated Health Associates, which actually has now gotten absorbed into Trinity Health. So I don't think it's really a physician group practice anymore, but you get my point. Groups of maybe down to 3 or 4 practice locations, or even individual providers, though generally individual providers are not very good about sharing data unless they're already in some kind of organized arrangement. So you have the people who provide the care. You have payers, the organizations that pay for it here in the US system. I know you have some people from outside the US that you work with, because I've in turn worked with some of them. But in the US healthcare system, it's mostly paid by insurance, mostly paid for by employers. So you have the big health insurance companies like an Anthem or an Aetna or a Kaiser, which is also a provider just for fun. And these two organizations have data that gives you a look at the same events, but from different perspectives. So the providers have clinical encounter records of somebody meeting with a physician or some other care professional. The payers have billing records as well as some of the provider encounter data. And then the third source that I've worked with is governmental and regulatory agencies, state Medicare, Medicaid organizations, and so forth. So it's sort of, for me, falls down like that. But increasingly, there's a fourth source of health-related data. Increasingly, I mean, it's been true for a couple decades probably, but things like wellness programs that are sort of alongside this. I mean, sometimes they're provided by a health payer, in which case they come a little bit more into that category. I have an Apple Watch. Apple tracks health data. There's the Oura Ring, which tracks a tremendous amount of health data. So there's a lot of stuff that's kind of in this fourth category. And from a regulatory perspective, provider data is covered by HIPAA here in the US. Payer data is covered by HIPAA here in the US. Data in the hands of a state or federal agency may or may not be, depending on context and why they have it. I'm completely leaving the VA alone. I'll let Dr. Shanawani talk about that because he understands it better. I've done some work with the VA, but it's not my place. And some of this health data that's collected by these third parties that are not actually payers or providers, they're not really part of the healthcare system, they're adjacent to it, may or may not be protected by HIPAA, depending a lot on context. And I mean, for example, the data Apple has isn't, but if it gets packaged up and sent to my cardiologist, it is, right? So in the cardiologist's hands, not Apple's. So those to me are sort of the four broad categories of where this comes from.
Appreciate that taxonomy. Hassan, would you like to add to that? Otherwise, I'm happy to kind of like talk about friction points.
So I think we're going to jump right into the friction points rather than repeating what Joe just said. I think it's if you use Fred Lee's "If Disney Ran Your Hospital," one of his principles is defining your market and your competition. I would argue that any data is health data. I would argue my food purchasing data from the local supermarket when I use my value card to get my 10% discount at Kroger's, one of the big chains here in Michigan, my gym data. I mean, people are using proximity data, right? They're using data for church attendance based on people that, using geospatial data, GIS data to identify. And, and I'll let Joe speak to the ISPCRs. They're doing some incredible GIS work at the University of Michigan. All of those things, any of those items can become health data. If you want to, using the very traditional taxonomy of what is HIPAA regulated data and what we are allowed to share, I as a practicing physician, I as a part of a federal agency, I think Joe really outlined that really very well. Experian has its own healthcare analytics data platform, right? I mean, that's health data. That's not HIPAA protected. There are privacy regulations, but those things really begin to fall in the cracks. And, my purchasing data at chain pharmacies and everything, my financial, I mean, if you use the WHO taxonomy of health, social, emotional, spiritual, financial, intellectual, any data can become health data. It all depends on what it is you're trying to serve and what's the health need what's the itch that you're trying to scratch. Back to you, Dan.
I just want to comment that I completely agree. That's well said. That's well said. Social determinants of health is a huge area of research right now, and
I mean that's a huge thing for ISPCR, ICPCR,
it is.
ISR in general at the university.
Yeah.
That work, just think about the national census data,
right,
which the ISR does a tremendous amount of work in, and what the health insights you can glean from. What if your Apple Watch captures the fact that you're walking 5 miles a day, you're getting your 10,000 steps in? That's health data.
Right. Or merely the fact that I can afford an Apple Watch and I update it every couple of years.
Also correct. Yeah.
Because income is a big, even when I was at Truven, we were doing some work with people who wanted to do social determinants of health linkage. I'm limited in what I can say, but the idea of linking health data, I mean, linking explicit health record data, right? With data that's useful for health insights and seeing what you get out of that. There have been discussions, for example, about linking medical record data and claims data with credit agency data for insights. And I mean, I think if that's done wrong, it's horrific. We're not being asked to make moral judgments here, but from an ethical privacy perspective, some of it's kind of scary, but 100%. Thank you for expanding on the definition. You're absolutely right.
So this takes me kind of into some of the areas that are, of course, really important for startups dealing with data. And so that can be clinical trials, that can be data they generate through some of their work. So when we're talking about data, in many ways, we're talking about regulation around data. And so I'd be interested to understand better what what your thoughts are, or for you to share some insights into the major drivers for cybersecurity initiatives, right? So we're looking at the government, we're looking at obviously, along that taxonomy, right? The providers, the payers, the government and regulatory agencies. Glad we did the taxonomy at the beginning. What can you tell us about the drivers of those initiatives, and how that is regulated specific to the US market? I'm not going to go international on this question. How are we talking about cybersecurity, and who's regulating those initiatives?
Hassan, do you want to take point on this one?
Yeah, so it's interesting if we use we're limiting the discussion at least briefly to the very traditional definitions of healthcare data, what goes into an electronic health record, my diseases, right? What we call the ample history, the allergies, meds, problems that I have, my last exam, those kind of elements. I think what we traditionally consider stuff that is those have fairly solid regulations. Now, what's interesting is that those regulations are written around me as an individual. And Joe, I would be interested in hearing your thoughts about, as we get into large scale analytics, population health, AI, my data point as a member of a population is not well regulated, right? And so, for example, there's almost no regulatory environment for data once it's been anonymized and de-identified. And so,
right, yeah, very true. It takes it out of the schemes.
And I would argue that the current market focus, again, and I don't want to pretend to be an expert in this space, but my sense of that large scale analytics is, my value is not as an individual in that market space, but it's as a single data point in an overall global analytics scheme. That's not well regulated, unfortunately. And this is where I would argue entities outside the United States continue to do a better job. In fact, the posture of the VA, and again, I'm not officially speaking, is that we see the public's data, CMS, think about Blue Dot data. There's, there's a ton of data that's out there that's deliberately de-identified, and then it's shared with the public. The idea being it's the public's data. It's paid for with taxpayer dollars, and it belongs to the American people. And so there are a dozen, go to the ICPSR websites and look at all of the different surveys where the data are freely available to download. There's dozens of studies. Joe, I don't want to speak to the maybe it's ISR I'm thinking about, the Institute for Survey Research, but there are tremendous data sets out there that are publicly available that have thousands, tens of thousands of individual entities. That's
I put a link.
Not well regulated, I have to say.
I put a link to I'm sorry, I didn't mean to.
No, I was just going to say, there's a lot of interest in that, and I think that's probably going to be where some of the questions come up. Joe, to you had a comment, sorry.
Oh, I was just going to say, I put a link to ICPSR. I am not representing ICPSR here today, just to stress, but I put a link to ICPSR's page listing the major collections of health research data that are available. And that's not everything we have. I mean, there's a reason they brought in somebody who had a HIPAA background. It wasn't just random, though very little of what we have is even a limited data set. Building on what Hassan says, all of the privacy regulations within the US, and they're a patchwork, right? We don't have an overarching privacy law in the US analogy to the European Union's GDPR. We don't have that. There's discussion, but there's always discussion. We regulate industries when something bad happens, which is why library borrowing records are regulated, or video rentals are regulated because of the Bork confirmation hearings, that kind of thing. Healthcare is regulated for a set of reasons that the broad reasons are obvious, so I won't go into the specifics. And we very much regulate to protect individual people to the extent that we do it, and absolutely not populations. Under HIPAA, once data has been de-identified by one of the approved methods, you can share it freely. Ordinarily, you only really see free sharing if it's done under the HIPAA safe harbor method, because the expert determination method, in my experience, often has conditions on it. But the safe harbor method isn't actually all that safe. For example, if you had a population outlier like the Octomom in a safe harbor data set, she'd be identifiable if you knew to look for her, just as a comment. Or the one guy in the country who had Ebola and was at Emory at one point. I mean, I'm talking from newspapers. It's okay for me to say this, but the focus is completely on protection of individuals. It's not on protection of populations. Once your data is anonymized, or de-identified is the HIPAA technical term, and is in a large data set, you're not protected. The European Union is a bit better about it, but largely, I think, and if you disagree with me, Hassan, I'd like to hear, largely in that they're more serious about what true anonymity is, to the point where it's actually very hard to attain GDPR anonymity relative to attaining HIPAA de-identification. So to me, it's more that the threshold is significantly higher while they're less directive as to methods under GDPR. Populations aren't protected. We at ICPSR actually do worry about protecting populations with access to some of our data. It's not necessarily focused around healthcare, but for example, data on the Native American populations, uses of that data in some cases have to be approved by the sponsoring Native American governmental organization at whatever level that is. So I think being worried about populations rather than individuals is not all that common. Hassan posted a really good link that I'll let him talk about, but I want to say back in the 90s when they first rolled out those affinity cards in supermarkets, a guy slipped on the floor in a supermarket that was part of a large chain, broke his leg because they hadn't, they'd washed the floor and they hadn't put up enough of those warning pylons or whatever. And when he sued the store over the injury, the store came back and said, hey, we have your purchase records for the past year or so. You buy a lot of alcohol, so we think you were probably drunk, and we're going to get this case pushed out because of your history of being a booze hound. And so even in the 90s, we had kind of a warning that those affinity cards were problematic. I'll hand back over though.
I so appreciate sorry, you were going to talk about the link. My apologies for talking over you. Go ahead.
No, not at all. I think what Joe is getting at is again, it's why I tend to define the question of privacy and healthcare data very broadly and well outside the regulatory framework that Joe and I live in, which is not to diminish the regulatory framework that Joe and I live in. If you want to put products out in a healthcare market, there's a lot of rules and regs out there. The post that I put in was, it's 10 something years old, how Target figured out a teen girl was pregnant before her father did. So is that pregnancy status healthcare data? In my opinion, it is. Now imagine that you couple that with my Google search for best drugs after a heart attack, and then you look at my geospatial data from my phone, and you see that I spent 4 days in a hospital with a cardiac center, and then I spent 3 days at a cardiac rehab facility. You don't need to do anything in the HIPAA world to know that I probably had some cardiac event and might benefit from some remote monitoring that is sold there. Again, not that I'm suggesting that that's how the data should use, but in my mind, I tend to broaden that out. And then, I can tell you, as a matter of practice, we are doing that to the benefit of our veterans. We are trying to take geospatial data from the DoD, which is highly regulated, and say, yes, you had a burn pit exposure and you deserve increased benefits. Remember, we think of the VA as a healthcare organization. We are also one of the largest provider of benefits in the world. And we are certainly a large provider of benefits to people with disabilities, special needs, work release programs, return to work programs. The work we do in service to veterans is actually pretty substantial in that space. And if you deserve benefits because of an exposure during your military career, we believe that you deserve to be made whole for that. We use those data and analytics to the benefit of people, and we believe that there's an immense opportunity to work with vendor partners in that space. Obviously, that's fraught, and the veterans all people deserve their privacy regulated, and we believe that there's likewise immense benefits to be provided to them from their history.
You are teeing up remote monitoring for me, and I think that's one of the topics I wanted to get to, simply because a substantial part of our 2023 cohort, but also a substantial part of startups out there in the world, are tying into the trend of hospital at home, of more and more treatment and monitoring of people in their homes. And we already teed up that blurry line of, if it's my Apple Watch, it's consumer data, but if it's a medical device and directly speaks to my physician, it is healthcare data. And so it tees up some of the discussions around what must you do as a startup. And again, these are early stage companies, some of them in the process of regulatory approval, some of them have just gotten regulatory approval. That, of course, entails some form of data security. I'd love to just hear what are the risks, what are the things that they have to pay attention to as they're going to market. Both of your opinions would be really valuable in that context. I'll start with you, Hassan. What, when we're talking about data security of hospital at home, medical monitoring at home, what are the things that we must think about to make that work?
So I think if you want to, I think the short answer to that question is if you want to have access, if you wish to be paid through traditional fee-for-service Medicare or veteran benefits or commercial insurance, the product has to be certified or cleared through FDA through either what's called the 510K process if it's a medical device. And to that end, you have to call your product a medical device. And so I'll give you a great example outside of data. In the tech world, we provide a lot of services in the VA to mobility impaired veterans. And so anything from a wheelchair to a scooter to now we are developing at substantial expense exoskeletons for spinal cord injury veterans who won't soon be able to walk around and, almost in like a robot suit, that exoskeleton type product. At the same time, there are thousands of startup organizations, some of them outstanding, some of them more fly by night, that want to call themselves healthcare products. right? And attaching an electric motor to the back of a beach chair doesn't make it a wheelchair. And so, and I can tell you that that's something that's actually been attempted. And so if you really want to have access to, I think, all that world of substantial income, you need to go through that regulatory process. Even Apple Watch, right? The Apple Watch got FDA clearance for the EKG function on the Apple Watch. And prior to that, I can't remember how many years ago, the iPads were cleared for interpretation of X-rays. I mean, a screen needs to be good enough so that you can actually read an X-ray. Likewise with remote patient monitoring and all of that. And remember, if your data is going to be uploaded to a cloud, you need to go through all of the cloud-based cybersecurity. I don't remember, Joe, you remember probably better than I. There's a specific regulatory environment for data security and integrity to make sure that your data, as it's being transferred from one piece of hardware to another. I don't remember the specific piece of regulation in that space, but and it's something that's Googleable. But what is the data as it's being uploaded from, say, a CPAP machine to the cloud, to interpretation, or a remote scale, or your Apple Watch? Like, if you're going to use it for healthcare data, it needs to go through that data security element, especially if you're going to introduce that data into my electronic health record. The DoD is very strict on this space because of all of the threats to cybersecurity. They have an additional regulation that I'm not knowledgeable about, but
I'm not
clearance
either.
for that's incredible.
Yeah. That's a really good overview of the issue, and you also dug down into it pretty well. I don't have a lot of experience in the medical device world. You obviously have to meet the FDA standards, as you said, and you have to be, that's going to include encryption during transmission and so forth. It's much less regulated if you're just providing data to your doctor, right? But certain aspects of it are still regulated as a medical device. Medical devices are not really my area, unfortunately.
Think about something as simple as a continuous glucose monitor, right?
Yeah.
There are thousands of them on the market, not thousands, but hundreds of them on the market. If you're going to use it people are using them as medical devices. Obviously, if you have a child with type 1 diabetes, you need the app that goes on your child's phone as well as the device on your phone to be regulated. You need to be able to send alerts to the school if your child is in school. So think about that entire ecosystem. That becomes very different if you're just using it as a wellness device, like you want to check your blood sugars so that you don't put too much sugar in your Starbucks coffee. And those are two very different markets. For one of them, you can just throw it anywhere and it'll sell. But if you want, Blue Cross Blue Shield or Aetna or Cigna to pay for it and cover it, it needs to meet basic requirements.
And I think there's a broader point associated with what you just said, which is that some of the constraints that will be placed on you with respect to protecting data as a startup may not be driven directly by regulatory concerns, but by the fact that you're selling into markets which require all their suppliers to meet sets of standards, whether they directly apply to them or not, right? If they have a concern that your device might be used in a medical device context, they're going to insist that you meet that. If they have a concern that data you share with them might come under HIPAA regulation, they're going to ask you to meet it. They might even insist that your company meet high trust, which is harder, right? So some of it, there's a regulatory source for some of this. And there's also the purchasing requirements of large healthcare organizations. And I've seen that come up with health tech companies that I was consulting to. Like, do we really need to meet all of this? Well, no. But if you're going to sell to, for example, Aetna, they have a package of things that they make all their suppliers meet. So suddenly, yeah, actually you do. And it's certainly true that it's very contextual, but at the same time, your clients are going to drive a lot of this.
Appreciate that. I'm going to grab a question from LinkedIn. Dale asked, are there any providers focusing on the model of creating a client-secured database that can have can then have them give provider access granted and rescinded? So if I have, can I grant access and rescind access to my data, and are there providers doing that? That may be outside of the realm of what you know, and so you get to say pass, but I wanted to put it in front of you.
Unless you want it first, I have a comment.
Sure, go ahead.
It would be extraordinarily dangerous for a healthcare provider to allow their access to patient records to be rescinded for somebody they're treating. Might not even be legal.
Yeah, so I'm not quite sure that I understand the question in its entirety. Let me tell you what I know about it. I think as an individual, your data cannot be released from a medical center without your permission, except for certain areas. So, for example, you come into the emergency room and you have insurance. We don't need your permission to share your information with your insurance company that you give us, right? Inherent in that request for care and ability for payment, we have to tell them that we treated you for A, B, and C, whatever those entities are. That's not really controllable. Beyond that, there are, we may use your data for research, especially if you go to a major academic medical center. Those you have to opt into, and often, and again, they'll be put all of that. In the commercial space, your ability to opt out of collected, anonymized, de-identified data, I'm not familiar with that. I can tell you in the VA system, veterans have the ability to opt out of data. And I can't remember off the top of my head if it's an opt-out or opt-in clause. Now, I believe it's an opt-out, where the veteran has to specifically state, I don't want my data included. The process is not difficult. There's a health information management office at every medical center. There's 171 of them across the country. And you just go and you say, this is how I want my data managed. And you can include it. Beyond that, in the Medicare space, like I don't think you can go in blue. I don't think you can blow, the blue dot type stuff. I don't think you can have I don't know if you can have your data easily excluded from that once it's been anonymized and de-identified, because then it's not really your data anymore. I think that's the way the government looks at it.
I want to swing back around on this. What I'm referring to is if healthcare records, and probably this is pretty broad, but certainly traditional documents about somebody's health or the care they've received, if they're used as part of making treatment decisions, under HIPAA, the treating provider then acquires some responsibilities with respect to retaining those records and providing them. It becomes part of something called the designated record set. And they're required to provide those for patients if they ask for them later, and they're required to retain them. So if we're talking about in a treatment context, I want to temporarily give my physician access to this third-party privately maintained EHR, and then after I've been treated by the physician, I'm going to take that access back. I honestly don't think that's how it can play out in real life. I think that the health system would ingest the records into their EHR, and then they'd keep them. Now, if you don't want that specific physician looking at your record, there are options under HIPAA. But I really don't think either under state law or under HIPAA, they could deliberately get rid of records that they've used as part of the treatment process. You retain those. And the hospital leadership wouldn't allow it either, because they'd want to retain them in the anticipation of potential lawsuits later, unfortunately. But there really is a feeling that you have to maintain the integrity of medical records and you have to keep them. Not knowing the context of the question, I don't know whether that response is on point, but it was my first thought.
Appreciate that. I'm sure some discussions can be taken offline on LinkedIn. I wanted to make sure in this climate, Everybody has heard of AI. AI and machine learning is the hot topic of the moment, even outside of healthcare, but it has been for a hot minute in healthcare. And so it's definitely on folks' radar, and it can be, and of course, several of the companies that we're working with have AI either as part of a product or as a standalone product. And so I would like to talk a little bit about how do we categorize the risks presented by AI in our medical data and our medical decision makings, and how do we mitigate what are and again with the lens of someone has a superior product to what is currently in existence in the clinic, and it is based wholly or in part on machine learning. What are some of the risks they need to address on their path to market?
You want me to do a hot take on this, and then Hassan, you can dig in?
Sure.
And I'm sure you'll come up with something I haven't come up with too. First off, if it's AI being used to aid physician diagnosis, and I don't remember the exact phrasing of this, but it may be an FDA regulated medical device, right?
Mhm.
If it's making decisions, if it's making conclusions about an individual patient's care, or if it's just assisting in physician decision making is different from independently making decisions, right? And when I was at IBM, I was part of Watson Health. They acquired us for that. And they didn't say AI, they said cognitive computing. But if you search IBM Cancer MD Anderson or IBM Watson MD Anderson, you'll see some stuff that it's probably better if I don't get into. I wasn't directly involved in it. It didn't work that great. Another area that you have to watch is if you're using a third-party AI service or any kind of AI service to process something that may be formally regulated health data, then that service throughout the chain has to meet the standards for that. So if you've decided, hey, I can put my call center on one of the AI services for the first level of calls that we get from patients or potential patients, that entire chain has to meet the standards, right? Probably not FDA at that point, certainly HIPAA if their data is traveling. And if you're sampling health data for learning, you'd better have access legitimately to the health data. If you're using anonymized health data for learning, it's safer from that point. So you've got the FDA, is this a medical device? You've got the chain of protection of the data. And then the third problem is simply from a medical ethics point of view. I hope the people on this call have read about the fact that people were using AI to auto-generate mushroom hunting books. And the AI was making up crap using sources and telling people to eat stuff that would kill them. Right? So you can't, and you're liable if you put that out there with the claim that this is a book that tells you which mushrooms are safe to pick. And some AI wrote it, and the AI is really doing is producing a document that looks like other books on mushrooms. It's not validating facts, right? Much like the AI that was asked to the AI got fed stuff to come up with recipes. And one of the recipes they used included both bleach and ammonia in it, which is how you make mustard gas if you're not a nation state. So you have that third ethics liability risk, which is that the current state of AI doesn't really fact check and can say some phenomenally bad things. I'll hand it back over, sir.
Yeah, so many places to take that question, Diane. I don't even, honestly, I don't know where to begin. I think I'm interested in hearing if there's specific questions. The FDA has put out a lot of stuff about AI, their Center for Device Management. I can't remember what it's called, the CDRH, something for devices in radiologic health, or I don't remember what it's called. They put out a statement 2-3 years ago about machine learning. What Joe talked about is, the big question that the FDA and providers are going to want to know is, Is the statement that's being made trustworthy? And I think Joe gave an example. There's been some letters for garbage for medical necessity. Oh, is that right, Diane? That's interesting. Yeah. I just lost my train of thought. Oh, so there was a great news article a few months ago about a doctor who, just as a joke, wrote a letter for medical necessity to an insurance company for, I think, like chemotherapy to help with insomnia. And I mean, it was something that you would never do in a million years. And the chat GPT cranked out a gorgeous letter for medical necessity that, on the face of it, and if you don't have, and of course, the market will always push down, right? We want to, right? Since the days of the printing press in Gutenberg, we've tried to take the power of salvation away from the guild, right? And if you look at every industry, banking, journalism, the strikes that are going on in the entertainment industry right now, it's taking about tech and pushing it down to a lower common denominator, taking care from the specialist physician to the generalists, from the doctors to the nurses, and from the healthcare industry to family and caregivers at home. We believe that that's a good thing from a public health standpoint. You're spreading out care, you're improving access. I believe that there are probably market opportunities. At the end of the day, though, you want to know that you're trusting the data. So the pendulum tends to swing in a more conservative space in healthcare. At the end of the day, we adopt it. I remember when I was a medical student, back when we rode horses to the hospital, and the buildings were all made out of wood, the EKG machines would not do an interpretation of the EKG. It would not tell you that the patient was having an MI or that they had a recurrent ventricular rhythm. Now the computer spits out a little thing that says, this is the axis waveform interval, and it makes an interpretation. This person has a left axis deviation consistent with the His-Purkinje, or there's an AVNRT. Again, it pushes it out. And I think for the most part, most people just trust that data. They don't give it a second guess. I'm sure that there are cardiologist purists out there that would say you don't want to do that. But pretty soon with radiologic imaging, we're going to get a lot of that interpretive information. From my standpoint as a physician and as a regulatory entity, I would want to know from a black box standpoint, and this puts your IP at risk, I want to be able to pop the hood. And so the question is, how willing are you as a tech innovator to share with me what's under the hood in your black box? I can't have some Harry Potter thing happen where I give you a bunch of information, some Harry Potter spell is cast, and you give me a diagnostic thing. That won't be adopted in the near future. Patients may like it, and there may be a market for it, but I can tell you the healthcare industry is going to take a dim view of that, at least for now. Culture may change over the next 5-10 years. We'll see where it goes.
Yeah. And I'd argue that a lot of people in the healthcare space wouldn't necessarily be capable of understanding what was going on under the hood, even if they did live.
Precisely. Yeah.
You really don't know what BS is happening there. I'm not anti-AI. I'm pro-AI with strong human supervision. I mean, even that's oversimplifying it. There are significant risks. I put one of them in the chat.
And we're sharing the links out. Thank you for that. These are real risks, and I think what you just spelled out for us is really is AI helping me make better decisions, or help a provider make better decisions, or is AI making the decisions? And the scrutiny then applied to each of those. So I think that's very helpful. We talk a ton about risks, and that's fully understood. But I'd also like to talk about some of the opportunities in the field of healthcare data and cybersecurity, data security, and AI. That said, perhaps I'll narrow it down to just the data and cybersecurity that have surfaced because some of the challenges that those fields bring. And so I'm curious if you have any examples in that space. And again, no is always a fine answer.
I think the quick answer, if I can tell you what I would love to have tomorrow, is a similar system to my credit rating being protected. If there was a market space where you could scrub my market data for certain elements of privacy. This isn't just healthcare, right? I mean, I think about TransUnion, Experian. You know, if I want to prevent anybody from taking a loan out under my name and you know, ID theft, there, you know, from that space, I think ID theft can be broadened out as a definition. And if you can create an opportunity to protect my privacy, then that in and of itself is a massive market opportunity that will sell. I mean, I'd pay for that right now for myself, my family, and I know a lot of other people that would love that information, would love something. That's sort of my quick one. I have 3 or 4 others, but Joe, do you want to jump in on any other ideas?
I mean, if I had a really brilliant idea, I'd be participating in this in a different way.
Joe, we expect you to come back with your next company
but
and
I
apply
might
for MedTech
well-
Innovator.
I might well want Hassan as a consultant because we are approaching this slightly differently and thinking of different things. I think privacy protection is a lot more problematic. I do have a link I want to share. It's slightly off topic for this, so I'll hold it. A lot of the home-based healthcare products are very valuable, and some of that value was shown during the height of the pandemic. Because being able to not have to come into the healthcare environment to interact with physicians, to do tests, as you said about blood glucose monitoring, CPAPs can send sleep data, heart monitors send data, that sort of thing. Tools that allow physicians to see patients remotely. While they do lose the physician some information, and I'll defer on that because you're actually a physician and I'm not. So you do lose some things, but you make it much more possible in some cases for the patients to seek care. So products that allow you to seek care remotely, products that allow you to monitor and improve the quality of healthcare. That's a continuous issue. I think privacy protection, additional privacy protection, is very important. It's also largely not something that credibly is going to be in the hands of individuals, unfortunately, apart from how they make choices about who they're willing to interact with. There is an immense ecosystem out there of organizations collecting analytics data for marketing. You know, the marketing tech community, the ad tech community, and they claim, you know, this data is not individually identifiable, but then it gets linked with the Facebook pixel or the Google pixel and you authenticate. And while most of this is not aimed at healthcare, I'll toss a link out here. And with this, Diane, I need to make a disclaimer. The author of this is the CEO of a company that I've done some work for, and that I actually hold a chunk of stock in. And what they're doing is they're selling to people who operate commercial websites software that allows them visibility into and the ability to block data flows to third-party entities that may be present on their site. But in my time there, you know, one of the things I learned is that the Mayo Clinic has both a healthcare website and a reference site. A lot of people go to the Mayo site for reference. The HIV page on the Mayo site had hundreds of outbound data flow, potential links, ads that record who visits, the Facebook pixel. You can share this on LinkedIn, that kind of thing. And some of that has leaked into the clinical portions of healthcare stuff as well. That's not what this discussion is about. And I'm certainly not saying, hey, go compete with Ian's company, because that would be wrong for me to do. I have stock in it. But I am saying you need to be aware that just as the scope of what you can look at as healthcare data is broader than we conventionally discuss it as, the scope of ways that your healthcare data, broadly or narrowly defined, leaks into the ad tech ecosystem from where it's just out there it's much more prolific than most of us realize. So it's really, I don't have a good solution, but
Joe, you brought up one thing, and I'm going to make a statement. And again, I want to be very clear that I'm representing my own individual views and not that of the government. I think there's actually another opportunity. As we have a regression in civil rights, work that I used to do 10 years ago, I was actually a consultant in trying to build an EHR that had no geographic tracking so that we could use it in war zones. And organizations like Doctors Without Frontiers
that's awesome.
and have wanted to have an EHR. You've seen, I'm sure, all of the ads for anonymous sexual health type stuff out there where you can get your pills for whatever, in a nice brown envelope or something like that. There is going to be more of that for people with gender identity issues, women's health care, a lot of people seeking private care in a very enclosed private environment where end to end, the integrity of their data is locked tight and not accessible by anyone, and creating that ecosystem where I can get medical care with a provider in very tight privacy may actually be an immense market opportunity that Joe's comments made me think about that I didn't think about 10 minutes ago, truth be told. And thinking now, Michigan is now a big recipient of people who are traveling across straight lines to get abortion care.
Yep.
And you can imagine if you're trying to get care in a state restriction where certain medical care is restricted, how do you do that across state lines without so that your civil rights are being preserved? I'm taking a very particular social posture on this call that may not be endorsed by many people, but the question remains, how is my data integrity preserved in that space so that I can get that care delivered to me? That's actually a really interesting market opportunity that I've not considered.
I hadn't either. I share that posture, by the way, and I've been in conversations about how you protect, e.g., pregnancy-related data when you may be operating in a state where the laws are hostile to protecting that. I don't have good solutions either, but I would add, if anybody's considering doing that, it becomes not just about conventional privacy protection against conventional bad guys, but how you arrange to not have to be responsive to state court orders for that data or state law enforcement actions. And the way you do that broadly is to not have the data or not have it in an identifiable form to respond to those subpoenas with. I don't have a good answer for it.
And this gets to where I think blockchain and cryptocurrency has moved, and they are well ahead of the healthcare market. Again, I don't wish to pretend to be an expert on it, but what I do know, I can tell you that that's what we looked at when we were looking at EHR models.
Yeah.
Can we use blockchain elements so that the data is anonymized as it moves from point to point, so that there's security and anonymization and de-identification of the data along the way. And it's only knowable to the two entities. Back to you, Dan.
One limitation of blockchain technology for that is that blockchain technology makes it very hard to remove material from the chain.
Right, and we couldn't get it to work. And so that's exactly what happened. That was the barrier.
And if you know my employment history, without going further, you can guess that I've been involved in conversations about the use of blockchain in healthcare. I think there are significant issues when you can't remove stuff. There are huge issues under GDPR with right to be forgotten. So in Europe, that either has to be heavily worked on or it's a non-starter. Even in the US under HIPAA, there are significant issues. And if we're talking about, I see your note, Diane, I know we're at time. If we're talking about a case where you have to be able to shield the data from outsiders who want access to it, or your patients will be harmed, and some of those outsiders are potentially governmental entities, it becomes exceedingly. I don't know the answer, but if someone's putting together a group, I'm here for you. Let me know.
And with that, I hope the two of you actually form a startup around this and apply to MedTech Innovator. I want to continue this discussion, and thankfully we can with the cohort But this is the time to thank our audience for joining us online. We'll be back next week with a panel on venture capital and corporate venture capital. So I hope you'll join us again. And with that, we will end the webcast.